tonight we're actually going to focus on the work of one property in Orleans County as a case study. But this info will really be applicable regardless of where you are, as long as you're somewhere in New England or upstate New York. We've chosen to focus here because Orleans County, being one of the northeasternmost 3 counties in Vermont, what's often called the Northeast Kingdom, is maybe one of the least impacted by invasives in the state. And so we really want to bring attention to the topic here. More than anywhere in Vermont, we probably still have the ability to control the outcome. But to do that, we need to recognize the problem. And just as importantly, we need to learn to recognize the plants. So we'll discuss why we're paying attention to this. We'll get a crash course on ID from Emily on some of the most common invasive species. And we'll hear about control methods from Sam that we're actually using on the farm. All with the long-term goal of restoring a full suite of native plants. So Bluffside, our location for the night, up in Newport, Vermont. VLT has owned this farm since the fall of 2015. We've been working with the community to maintain the farm for its agricultural uses, its ecological assets, and enhanced recreational opportunities. It's about 130 acres, mix of farmland and forest and shoreline, sitting right there on the shores of Lake Memphremagog. But let's start with some basics. So what is an invasive species? So for our purposes tonight, we'll refer to the definition found on the VT Invasives website, which is a great resource. You're going to see it referred to throughout the presentations. But they say invasive species are plants, animals, and other organisms that are introduced to a non-native ecosystem and also cause harm to the environment, economy, or human health. So really 2 important pieces here: species that is not native to the ecosystem and that causes harm. There's all types of invasive species. There can be invasive insects like emerald ash borer, invasive wildlife like feral hogs, invasive fungus like white nose syndrome that's causing the decline in our bats. But tonight we'll really be focusing on invasive plants, specifically terrestrial invasives that are found in uplands mostly. And worth noting, while some folks might consider some native species invasives in certain situations if they're causing harm, like poison ivy, tonight we'll be focusing just on the non-native plants. So let's start with the big question. Why do we care? And to do that, let's start with how they got here and where they come from. So one reference for New England says that when you look at all the non-native invasives in the region, 10% were accidental introductions. So they might have come as packing material from shipping, like stiltgrass. Another 30% through conservation programs. In previous decades, we actually thought planting some of these things, like autumn olive, was a good thing for wildlife, both for a food source and cover, and we've learned better. But 60% through the horticulture industry. And because this last group tends to come from plantings around homes, they tend to first escape and establish around population centers, like Newport. So you can imagine that if even half the home parcels that you can see on this photo around Bluffside Farm have non-native invasive plants in their yards, the seed source that will be produced and distributed over time. And once these things are here, they tend to have certain characteristics that provide them advantages over our native plants. So this image was actually taken by my colleague, Peter Van Loan, in Dorset, Vermont. And here we can see honeysuckle and burning bush dominating the understory of the forest. If you look closely, you'll see that these are the only plants left with leaves. So that longer photo period just means that they have a longer growing season. They leaf out earlier, they drop their leaves later, they have more time to do their stuff. They may also be prolific seeders and have good strategies for seed dispersal. Plants like Barberry, the berries actually have a laxative effect in birds, so they're dropped quickly after the birds eat them, passing through the digestive tract. And in most cases, these plants don't have their plant diseases and pests that they've co-evolved with in other parts of the world, like Europe and Asia. They're just not present to keep those populations in check. So we can quickly have situations where the invasive species are outcompeting our native plants, either forming monocultures or really limiting species diversity. And so again, why do we care? Why is this bad? Plants are plants, right? Well, not really. If we look at our native ecosystems as interconnected webs or maybe even wired circuits, these non-native plants start to rewire those connections and bypass some really important functions. So for example, the classic is monarch butterfly evolved to feed only on milkweed. So no milkweed because of invasive plants, no monarchs. Invasives tend to support less insect diversity. So if you're a mother bird, or in this case, a father, like this male black-throated blue warbler feeding your nestlings, you could have less caterpillars and spiders and whatever else you'd like to feed them around. And less food and compromised habitat means less productivity. These non-native plants produce lots of fruits and berries. They do get eaten, but they're often of lower quality for the critters that are eating them. So not giving them the fuel reserves that they need for their long fall migrations. The classic analogy is if you're about to run a marathon, you don't want to be eating candy bars. And think about eating barberry berries and the laxative effect before you take off. They can also form dense thickets where our native predators can't hunt small mammals, which may lead to more ticks on rodents and tick-borne diseases like Lyme. And some plants, like honeysuckle, are actually allelopathic, which means they release chemicals into the soil that preclude other plants, native plants, from regenerating. So no new trees, no new forests. We're in a time when there's a lot of pressures on our woods. Development, fragmentation, climate change leading to different precipitation and moisture and drought regimes. The impacts of these non-native species, and here we can include insects like emerald ash borer, will really change the way our forests work. And we don't fully understand how all these stressors are going to combine and impact them. But we do know that we want them healthy and nimble and able to respond to these new impacts. So controlling invasives is one way to try to maintain and restore ecological function. So back to Bluffside, the cornerstone of any management is first understanding what you're dealing with. So we knew there was an invasive plant issue here. Our first step was to work with interns and AmeriCorps members to do this rapid assessment mapping project. It's a relatively quick process, not meant to locate every plant, but just to give us some data to think about how we want to start our control efforts. And Sam's going to be talking in a lot more detail here. But I'll point out that we found a number of species: Japanese barberry, common buckthorn, bush honeysuckles, wall lettuce. And each point on the map represents a cluster of these plants. And in places where larger areas are infested, that's where you see the colored in polygons. So, this might represent half of the plants that are out there, but it's a good place to start, and we'll continue to collect data as we learn more. It's interesting to notice, though, that a lot of the occurrences are along the field edges where there's more light. Many of these non-natives, invasives, they love disturbance, they love light. And as they colonize these edges, they're really poised to take advantage of disturbances in the interior forest. And that's what happened after a timber harvest that was conducted here in 2011 and really allowed for the spread away from the perimeters into the interior forest on a harvest that happened in the western section of the property. So once we roughed out the extent of the problem, we needed to figure out how we were going to get the control work done. So we worked with our local NRCS office, Natural Resource Conservation Service within the Department of Agriculture here in Newport, to secure a grant for invasives control through the Conservation Stewardship Program. They're a great resource. There's a lot of info that they can provide. If you have a large enough parcel, you can contact your consulting forester or your county forester, or contact them directly to discuss program options. They provided the funding, and then we were able to contract with the NorthWoods Stewardship Center to actually do the control work. So Up next, Emily's going to be talking about ID, and then Sam's going to get into some specifics around the control. But I hope we've given you some basic information about why and how we've chose the approach we have at Bluffside. But I want to wrap it up like this. Dr. Doug Tallamy at the University of Delaware, who's an excellent speaker on this topic, he suggests that while we'd want to control invasive species by offering a definition of a native species. He says a native species is one that has evolved in a given place over a period of time long enough to develop that essential relationship for life. And ultimately, that's what we want to promote and restore, are these relationships that promote life and well-being for people and the land. So I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thanks, Dan. And just let me know if I should turn off my video if I'm getting too scrambly, but I'll keep it on until it gets rough.
We'll let you know. You sound good right now.
Okay, thanks. We'll go with it. All right, thanks everybody. I know Dan already showed you this site, but I just wanted to emphasize this again. It's a fantastic resource. You can search up at the top right-hand corner by a species. Yep, you got it, Dan. Or in the lower left if you want to just go by category. But you can type in specific species. I often spell them incorrectly and I still get to the right site. I use this site very regularly. It's a fantastic resource. I point a lot of people to it. So after that, I'll just walk you through some basic plant identifying features for some of the more common invasive plants that we find up here in the kingdom and in Orleans County. So the first one, which I think Dan already mentioned, is Japanese barberry. So this one's commonly used in landscaping because in the fall, the leaves turn like a very bright orange red. It has small white flowers. This is a fantastic picture, up close picture, and small little green leaves in little clusters. And one of the key identifying features is that there's an individual thorn, which you can kind of see in the left-hand side of this picture along the stem. The thorns are individual, they're not in clusters. And when the fruits are mature, which we're coming up to about, we would be seeing those now. I think I've seen them. They're small and red and a little oval berry. So you can move on to common barberry, thank you. So compared to Japanese barberry, the leaves are larger. They have a little bit of a tooth margin. They're just kind of less delicate in structure and they have thicker stems. Instead of the individual thorn, there are 3-pronged spines along the stem. And like I said, oval leaves with toothed edges. And the flowers are still in clusters, but they're larger and tend to be a little bit more yellow in color. The common barberry plants can grow really, really tall and are more in clumps. So if you want to switch to the next slide, Dan, we'll see another picture of Japanese barberry. That's great. So, I see that comment. So the Japanese barberry, the flowers can be white or yellow. I think they're typically white flowers. So sorry if that photo is not great. You can go, all of this information that I got here is actually from the VT Invasive site. So you can go on there and there's a lot of photos, way more photos than I have here today. So this is just another picture of Japanese barberry. And this is a very classic photo of what we're trying to avoid up here. And it just grows. So not like common barberry in very, very tall clumps, but it technically spreads along the forest floor. And I have seen some of this behavior in the Northeast Kingdom. So because of this dense forest floor, it's a great habitat for small mammals. And so Japanese barberry has actually been linked to increases in Lyme disease because that habitat is such great for small mammals that carry the black-legged ticks. All right, we'll move on to common buckthorn. So this is common buckthorn, and we'll just focus on the leaves and the twigs right here. So both buckthorns have a sub-opposite leaf arrangement pretty much, which means they're almost opposite, if you can see pretty clearly from that photo. The common buckthorn has lightly toothed leaf margins, and the veins are parallel. And in the smaller photo, you can see that it has a sharp spine at the end of the twig that common buckthorn typically has. All right, we can move on to the fruits and bark of common buckthorn. So it has these bright black berries when they're ripe. And interesting, in that smaller photo, the inner bark, so if you scrape lightly through that outer bark, has a bright orange inner bark when the stems are a little bit more mature. So not teensy tiny. All right, we'll move on to glossy buckthorn. Moving right along. So similar leaf and leaf arrangement and similar fruit, but it does have a simple prominent veination instead of that parallel veination, and has a slightly smoother leaf margin. I'll have another photo comparing the leaves next. There usually isn't a spiky point. And another distinguishing feature for glossy versus common is that the glossy buckthorn does not have that bright orange inner bark. It just has that gray-brown bark. So here's a comparison slide of the buckthorn leaves. Glossy is on the left and common is on the right. So just to pay attention to, just take note of the leaf margin and the vein pattern there. And just again, to emphasize, all of these photos came right from VT Invasives, so you can dig in there or follow along. All right, Dan, you can move on to honeysuckle, everybody's favorite plant. So there are 4 different invasive species of honeysuckle found in Vermont right now. They're all pretty similar. They all have an opposite leaf arrangement. So they're right opposite one another. They have small egg-shaped leaves, and they all have very pretty and very fragrant flowers of different colors, and they all have brightly colored berries at some point. The plants are often in the field edges or in hedgerows, or they're in openings in the forest canopy. And like the plants that I've mentioned so far, these are primarily spread by birds. So everything we've talked about, buckthorn and barberry and honeysuckle, are typically spread by birds with the seed, eating the seed. All right, move on to the next slide, Dan. So this is just, it's very difficult to identify the different species of invasive honeysuckle. Actually, even when I took botany classes, we just had to say Lonicera, the genus, and we didn't have to go down to species ever. But what you can do is you can distinguish between whether or not the plant is native versus invasive. So the picture here is showing you, if you cut into the middle of the twig carefully, you can see the pith of the stem, and the one on the left, or the upper one, is a non-native, so it has a brown or hollow pith, and the native honeysuckles do not have that brown or hollow pith, so the lower one or the one to the right. And that picture is also on VT Invasives. All right, we'll move on to Phragmites, also known as common reed. So the key identifying features that help me with this is that it typically grows in wet areas or edges of wet areas or wetlands. It grows in really dense patches. It can be small or large patches, but they grow. It's pretty much all you'll find. And it gets pretty tall compared to native grasses and native reeds. The leaves are wide and flat, kind of like a big grass, and they're smooth, hairless. And the flower heads, which you can see in this photo and you'll probably see now, are big and kind of fluffy, like if you saw a flower of a grass, but like times 20. And usually they're purplish, I think, in color. So this is a great photo. And unlike the plants that I've mentioned earlier, this is a plant that's actually spread by its roots and the transportation of pieces of the roots. So this is one that's commonly spread by excavators or other earthwork equipment. So that's where we're working on having equipment get cleaned, or coming right after equipment has worked in a wet area. So we can switch on to knotweed, which is the last plant I'll mention. So this one is the bamboo-like plant. So it has a very big, very hollow stem. It's shrub-like and can grow over 10 feet tall. So if you're driving around and seeing it now, it's going to be really tall at this point in the growing season. It's typically found on roadsides and stream banks, and just like Phragmites, it's often moved through root fragments, and yeah, just like Phragmites. So thank you all for that really quick crash course in common invasive plants, and I will pass it on to management to Sam. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So for this part, I'm going to review some of the strategies and specific methods you might use for controlling invasive plants if you've identified a problem and identified some plants. I'm going to start off with some key concepts that hopefully are relevant almost anywhere that you're working and with almost any species. So a few things to keep in mind. And some of these Dan and Emily mentioned already. So the first one that I think is really important is, what is your ultimate goal of controlling invasive plants? It's really not to get rid of the invasive plants, it's to restore some sort of system in that area. Hopefully restoring native biodiversity, natural communities, or something else that you want in that area. Most often that means having a plan for getting other plants to grow after your invasives are gone. Next key point is that you've really got to be good at identifying the invasive species that you're dealing with. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them, which Emily sort of alluded to, especially with honeysuckles, and I saw we had a question about honeysuckles, but really a lot of invasives, it's easy to misidentify invasive plants. So we don't want you to waste your time or really damage native ecosystems by trying to control something that's not the invasive species you thought it was. And then the other key piece is that every invasive species has different growth habits, different ways of spreading, and because of that, has different ways that you can effectively control it. So get really good at identifying those things. There are fantastic apps that you can load on your phone. They're really helpful. I was resistant to that for a long time, but they are super helpful. And also great information on VT invasives. Another key concept that I really want to reiterate a couple of times through this presentation is that working with a professional is a good idea. You'll get better results. In some cases, you really have to avoid breaking laws or causing impacts to human health or causing impacts to the environment. And especially when you get into working with chemicals, but really with any kind of control, to have a good outcome, it's a great idea to work with a professional, even if you just consult with them and then do a lot of the work yourself. Another key concept in your invasive control, you've got to take a close look at site conditions. So that's the specific site that you're working on, the place that the invasive plants are growing. And that's going to help you decide what methods are going to be effective for controlling them, and also what methods are going to be appropriate. You might have site limitations, things like wetlands, things like wellheads. We'll talk about those in the next few slides, but site conditions are important to understand. And then a final key concept, which hopefully you all leave this webinar very excited to follow this one. We encourage you to take action sooner than later. One of those photos that Emily showed of, I believe, Japanese barberry spreading through the understory of a forest, really with 100% cover. It's pretty concerning. So if you can take action soon before it gets to that point, you have a better chance of controlling these plants and a better chance of restoring a functioning native ecosystem. So moving on to a couple of tools. One tool that I use to start the process, figuring out how we're going to deal with an invasive plant problem, I call it the decision tree. And this addresses a couple of the big questions that you're going to need to work through as you make a plan. So one of your big questions that you're initially going to have to tackle is whether or not you had the option of using chemicals, of using herbicides to control invasive plants in your situation. This is where site limitations often come into play. So for example, if you're working near a drinking water well, if you're working near a wetland, if you're working near an organic hay field, these are all things that are going to impact whether or not you can use chemicals in a specific site. And then really importantly, whether it's you or if you're working with other landowners, that person might have preferences for or against using chemicals. So that's a really important starting point and decision to make. And it might vary throughout a property. You might, for example, have buffers along an organic field where you can't use chemicals, but other sites that aren't so sensitive where maybe you can. So that's one decision. From there, it kind of guides you toward the gist of this is if you decide to use chemicals, herbicides, or if you think they're an option, I really, really encourage you in that case to hire a professional or consult with a professional. It's not strictly required. There are some cases where you can do herbicide work yourself, but there's a lot that can go wrong. Even if you're not worried about violating state and federal laws, which you probably should be concerned about, there are some really potentially serious impacts if it's not done right, again, to human health and to the environment. So hiring a licensed pesticide applicator is a good way to make sure that it's done in in an appropriate way. I also put an arrow in here that says if you're doing manual control, you can do a lot of that work yourself. But again, it's a good idea to talk with a professional. They're going to have some good tips for you. In any of these options, you kind of have to consider whether your time, money, and resources are limited. If you have unlimited time, money, and resources, that is a great situation to be in. And in that case, I would recommend that you control all the invasive plants that you are dealing with and do it soon. That's a good situation. If, like most of us, you have limited time, money, and or resources, that's the reality for most people. A couple of strategies: you can apply for cost share funding. I'm going to cover this a little bit later on. Dan had mentioned NRCS. That's a great source for cost share funding that's accessible to many landowners. And the other strategy that I would recommend if you have limited time, money, and resources is to try to pick areas where you can have the best conservation outcome, so the best positive impact by doing some invasive control, or the place where you're most likely to have success. So those are a couple of key things. I'm going to move on to one more tool, which you've heard about before, and this is VT Invasives. This is a great website, and again, definitely encourage you to visit this website. And what I'd like to point out here specifically is if you navigate your way to the plant that you're trying to deal with, and you get to that page, there's going to be a lot of information there. And one thing that's easy to overlook that's incredibly helpful is a little button toward the top that says treatment. There's another one that says fact sheet, but the one that says treatment is super helpful. If you click on that, it's going to download a document that has species-specific information about how that plant grows, how it disperses, and some of the effective ways that you can manage it. So really, really good resources there. Okay, so now I'm going to launch into a few of the common methods that you might consider if you're dealing with invasives. And again, I'm kind of tossing these out as options, things you might consider, and you're really going to have to think pretty hard about the specific species and the site you're working on to decide which of these is effective. So first option, this one's pretty simple. Most people can get out and do this, and that's either mowing or just cutting down plants. And honestly, it has somewhat limited effectiveness. There are a few species out there that spread primarily by seed, and for those, it's really effective to just cut them back before they seed. For most of the species that we're dealing with, it's moderately effective. It can limit the spread of these species, it can limit seed production, and if there's a lot of other native competition around, it can actually be fairly effective in getting rid of these over a few years. The timing is important. You want to do this at an appropriate time of year for the species you're dealing with. It's important to do this repeatedly. If you do it once and walk away, you might actually make things worse. The plants might kind of bounce back stronger than they started, invasive plants, and that's not what you're going for. And then the other key thing, I think, is, again, recognizing the species you're working with. Some of the plants that you might recognize that spread a lot by dense roots and rhizomes, so things like knotweed and Phragmites, those are really, really tough to control by cutting or mowing. You might limit their spread a little bit, but the roots and rhizomes are just so dense and so extensive that it's really hard to have much effect by cutting and mowing. So if you're willing to step up and do a little bit more hard work compared to this, your next option would be either pulling or digging plants out. This can be pretty effective. It's hard work. I'll be honest, it's pretty hard work, but you can be really effective for plants that have small or kind of medium-sized root systems. They might not look small when you pull them out, but compared to knotweed and Phragmites, some of these shrubs, like I think this is a honeysuckle shrub in the photo, honeysuckle, barberry, got thorns, be careful, buckthorn, some of the little herbaceous plants like garlic mustard. You can be really effective at controlling those populations by pulling them repeatedly. And again, timing is going to be important. Following up and doing it multiple years is going to be important for sure. So one other option for manual control that I do want to mention, I think this is really appealing to a lot of folks, and that is smothering. So basically using a tarp or some kind of fabric to basically cover an area and the plants can't grow up through, they can't get sunlight, and that kills them back. Can be a pretty good option for areas that are really dense. So this one actually might work pretty well for something like Phragmites or knotweed, where it's 100% cover of invasive plants. You do have to do a good job cutting those back. you do need to have a really durable tarp. There are a couple of things that might go awry. So some of those plants that I just mentioned are really good at growing out from underneath the tarp. And then one other key consideration I would add to this is once you put a tarp on the ground, you kind of reduce the ability of other plants to grow there as well. So this gets back to one of my key concepts. It's really important to have a plan for how you're going to get other plants to reestablish in that area later on once you've controlled the invasives there. Okay, so moving on to a couple of possible options if you're on a site and if you are willing to use herbicides. Probably the most focused and easiest to do sort of chemical control option is cut stump for woody plants. You basically cut the plant off near the ground. This works well for single stemmed shrubs, for small trees. Buckthorn can get to be a small tree. Cut it off near the ground, spray a little bit of herbicide on the stump, and it prevents that plant from resprouting. There are some real benefits to this. It uses a really, really small amount of herbicide. It's very focused. There's almost no risk of impacting pollinators or other plants. It's a really targeted and low impact way of doing invasive control. That being said, it can be a lot of work. It can be kind of monotonous, and it can be really difficult for plants like barberry that have tons of small stems, but you certainly can do it. Another option for using herbicides to control invasives is foliar spraying. This one's familiar to a lot of folks. This is using something like a backpack sprayer or another pump sprayer and pretty low concentration, a diluted solution of herbicide, and spraying it on the leaves of a plant. For this one, I really encourage you to work with a professional if you think that foliar spraying is appropriate on your site. This one has some, there's a lot of potential to go wrong here, and licensed applicators have a lot of training and a lot of experience in minimizing drift, making sure that they're spraying only on the plants that they're intending to control, making sure to time it to avoid impact to pollinators, and lots of other things. So this one, it's a little bit tricky to do it right, but it can be pretty effective. It can also be really efficient. I will say that, if you are dealing with a really, really large area of invasives, most of the other methods that we've talked about so far are going to be pretty tough to implement. So this one is efficient and cost effective. A couple more options for using herbicides. These are really directed again. So specifically for plants with hollow stems, you can clip them off and drip a little bit of herbicide into the stem. It's labor intensive, it's monotonous, but it certainly works. And kind of like cut stump, this is very directed, very focused, very little risk of impact to other plants or animals in the ecosystem. So pretty good option. One thing to be careful of here, again, work with a professional, but it's important to make sure that you don't exceed the amount of chemical that you can use per acre. And that's specified on the labels of those chemicals. But you actually can end up putting more than you mean to if you're dripping in a lot of stems. And I'll cover one more method that we've used with pretty good success. This is stem swiping. It's a version of low volume foliar application. And basically we use something along the lines of a sponge glove over a rubber glove and wipe an herbicide on the stem of a plant. Works well on Phragmites, works well on scattered stems that are mixed in with other vegetation. It's pretty easy to minimize impact to the other vegetation. It's a little bit of a messy process in terms of you need to be really careful to have good quality PPE. You need to be really careful about how you're handling the equipment that you've used. So once again, I'm going to say this is best left to professionals, but it can be pretty effective on those sites with scattered Phragmites. So that's the very quick run through of some different treatment methods. And a couple of final thoughts that apply to all of those to kind of recap. Don't be upset if you come back the next year and there are still some invasives. You're almost always going to need a follow-up treatment, whether it's 1 year of follow-up treatment or 5 years of follow-up treatments. You almost always need to go back and do something afterward. There are going to be seeds in the seed bank that continue to sprout. There might be root sprouts. There might be some that you miss. That's okay. Don't be discouraged. Keep at it. And along those lines, definitely encourage you to continue monitoring those areas. Even if you think you've had a really good control and you've taken care of the plants out there, do get out there and keep checking for a bunch of years. Keep an eye on it and see if they come back. And then through all of this, really important to make a plan. Make a plan, using species-specific information, using the site limitations that you identified earlier. Make a really good plan and then follow through with it. I think this one can be tough as well when you see all those invasive plants out there and you just want to do something now. But sometimes you need to step back, make that plan, and follow it. And then one final key point is when you dispose of those plants, make sure you do it appropriately. Don't put them in the compost bin. They'll grow in your compost bin. Don't throw them in your neighbor's yard. They'll grow in your neighbor's yard. So you can either compost them on site, kind of in a separate compost pile. Some of them burn really well. Things like honeysuckle can burn really well. That's a way to get rid of them. There are some other methods, but definitely be careful not to transport these plants around and establish them in new places. So shifting gears to one of these final slides. I'm going to again reiterate that the points about working with a professional, and those professionals could be a number of people. For those of you who own forest land, you probably already work with a consulting forester, and most foresters in Vermont have some familiarity with invasive plants, whether they do control on those plants or have worked with other contractors who do. Your consulting forester is a great first resource. Along those lines, county foresters, many of you, especially if you're in the current use program, probably interact with your county foresters. They're going to be able to point you toward folks who can help you out with those problems, invasive plant problems. And again, they probably have experience with this as well. If you get into using pesticides, you definitely need to talk to a Vermont licensed pesticide applicator. These are the only folks who have the training and certification to do invasive control with chemicals or to even give advice about it. So there's a list. We'll put up a link after my presentation about, there's a link from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture where you can find licensed applicators. And you might also have conservation groups. So I think most, certainly Dan and Caitlin and lots of other folks at VLT and lots of people in different conservation groups are working on invasive plants. You'll hear about that a little bit later. So lots of folks who can help you out. Through all of this, working with a professional, it saves you time and money, you get it done right, and it minimizes impacts to the environment. So all good things there. And a couple of quick notes on funding. So this often comes up, right? You have a great plan, you want to do some invasive control, and you realize it's going to be expensive. NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, Dan mentioned them earlier. Federal agency that offers cost shares. Lots of landowners are eligible to apply. We do have a link here, and I'll put that in the chat in a moment. There are links to find your local field office, and the best way, if you're interested, is just contact the NRCS field office, see what they have for funding right now, and see what it takes to get started in applying for that. One tip that I would give from working with some folks who have NRCS contracts, talk with NRCS about what they can offer and how much they can cost share. And then it's also great to get a cost estimate from a contractor, from a licensed pesticide applicator or another contractor who can do the work for you, and make sure that that cost share is going to work out financially for you. And then this isn't exactly funding, but I do want to kind of highlight, I've seen some really, really successful projects. A few towns with conservation commissions. Folks on those commissions have gathered together, led some really impressive volunteer efforts on controlling invasive plants in their communities. And even just groups of friends. I've seen a couple of examples of just people getting together. They control invasives on their own land. People start noticing it. They gather a bigger group. Really an impressive amount of work gets done when you have more hands on the job. So I encourage you to take those kind of grassroots efforts as well. That wraps up everything that I have. I think I'll turn it back over to Dan for a little bit of another type of resource that's available to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Sam. And since the Orleans County Sisma, Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area, is a sponsor and a partner tonight, we wanted to describe a little bit about what a Sisma is. It's just it's kind of what it sounds like. It's a cooperative group of folks that get together to deal with invasive plants. And that might look like applying for grants, or it might just look like getting together and sharing information. We have a relatively new formed Sisma in Orleans County with a number of conservation organizations. I'm not going to try and name them all because I'll forget someone and then feel badly about it. But, and we're just starting to think about how to do more education and outreach, bring information to the public, and how to really get on top of this in Orleans County. Right now, we do have a Facebook page available that we're just getting up and running, so you could check that out to look for more information. But again, next week, we're having the walk at Bluffside Farm in Newport. So really a recap of what we talked about tonight, but in person, on the ground, with real people and real plants. So if you're up in the area, think about joining us for that. And we'll either put a link in the chat for the sign up, the registration at NorthWoods, or you'll also get a follow-up email with resources, and there'll be a link to the sign up there as well. So with that, I think we can come back and take some questions.
Okay, sounds great. Thanks, Dan, Sam, and Emily, for a great hour of sharing a lot of knowledge there. Before we jump into questions, I just wanted to do a couple of announcements just so that as folks need to sign off, I can just let you know that you will be getting an email with a short survey. We do take your feedback to heart, so please answer, what worked, what didn't work, and then ideas that you'd like to see for future webinars. So we definitely take that into account. Check out some of our upcoming events that Dan mentioned, the walk at Bluffside, and there's some others, including fall wildflowers. If you're over in the Champlain Valley, there's an in-person event at Charlotte looking at some work to create habitat for migratory songbirds, and then our annual meeting with some field trips. So I think maybe, Dan, if we take that down so that folks can see your faces. There we go. Okay. Excellent. Great. So we had some great questions come in while you all were chatting. So I want to just address Annie's first, since hers was one of the first ones to come in. And Annie was wondering what can be done. So this is an outreach question to promote general awareness of gardeners in our area. Are you aware of efforts or things that folks could do to that, share this info with that population?
I think maybe one initial thing is look to see if there's a Sisma in your area. There's a number of them located around the state and the region, and they might have local resources, local contacts where you could reach out to either homeowners associations, lake associations, conservation commissions, local communities to really think about ways to spread that information, get that information out there. I think a great resource that I hope is still available, that I saw a number of years ago, was put out by the Nature Conservancy with a list of replacement plants. So we plant these ornamentals. Often they're invasive because they provide some service for us. We like the color they turn in the fall, or we like the flower as well. There's lots of native plants that provide those same functions, and there's options for replacing those while kind of maintaining some of those native ecosystems and supporting local wildlife populations at the same time. But if maybe Emily or Sam have more to add to that.
Great.
That was great, Dan. And if I can find it, there's also a fantastic link from Audubon with native plant alternatives. I'll try to toss that in the chat if I can find it.
Excellent.
Great. Excellent. So a question about buckthorn. So Emily, maybe you could just kind of review a little bit about the thorns on buckthorn. Are the thorns present on sort of both glossy and common? Maybe if you could just review that.
Yeah, I think so. That thorn that's kind of like a thorn, it's like a pokey end at the end of each twig, is on common buckthorn. It's not always present, but it's usually, from what I've seen, it's on common. And glossy buckthorn I don't think there's any thorn-like features on glossy buckthorn. If anyone knows anything differently, feel free to speak up.
That's great. And then maybe just a follow-up question to that. Jessica was wondering if there are native plants like dogwoods that might look like blackthorns that folks could easily confuse, maybe chokecherry, those. Maybe if you could just sort of, anyone go over sort of some of those common ones. Yeah,
that's great. And I think, like Sam mentioned, that's kind of the first step, is making sure that it is actually an invasive plant. So yeah, there are a lot of lookalikes, different cherry species. Dogwood is one of them. Apple, the leaves are similar. On VT invasives, there's different fact sheets for all of the plants that we've talked about, and it has all of the common lookalikes and pictures and descriptions. Just to point out, dogwood is, like I mentioned, the buckthorn has that sub-opposite branching pattern. Dogwood is a true opposite branching pattern. So that's one of the key identifying features there. But just to clear all of the lookalikes, I'd recommend looking at that VT invasive site and looking at that fact sheet for buckthorn, either of the buckthorns, and it will show you all of the common lookalikes. But yeah, great question. Good due diligence.
Great, super. Thanks, Emily. So to switch gears a little bit, Phragmites, is that what folks are seeing along highways, in ditches, that sort of thing?
Boy, what don't we see along highways and ditches? So, yeah, those are the prime spots for invasion, right? Because they're constantly disturbed, and a lot of these plants like those disturbed environments. And when we mow them regularly, we kind of recreate that condition where they can reestablish. And if we don't do it thoughtfully, we can move it with the mowing equipment, right? So yes, Phragmites definitely grows in ditches along highways.
Great. Or not great, but thank you for answering that question, Dan. So a great question about just sort of strategy. This person, in cleaning out their hedgerow, they're wondering if they like to do that to reveal their pasture walls. Is this inviting invasives that like light and don't have that, otherwise to compete with the pasture grass? And then a follow-up is also, is the darker unmanaged forest less compatible with invasives that prefer, penetrable forest canopy?
I'll jump in to start answering this question, because that actually reminds me that I wanted to mention in my section about control that often the best way to have kind of a long-lasting ecosystem where invasives are not as much of a problem is to maintain a lot of native diversity. So maintaining lots of other native plants that are dense and competing really well. So yeah, I think, if you remove everything from a hedgerow, you probably do create a site that maybe is a little bit more likely to have invasives come in later. At the same time, when you have those really open hedgerows, it's easy to see your invasives come in. So, as long as you're monitoring, I think you can keep on top of that. And let's say to the second part, the deep shade of forests, again, invasives, generally, you're going to find less of them there, but there are some that are pretty shade tolerant. And certainly if anything changes in a forest, so say you have a deep, dark shaded forest and then a bunch of trees blow down, or if you do a timber harvest, that can really open up space for invasives to take off. So recognizing those changes, I think, can be really important in a forest. If anyone has anything to add, please jump in.
I might just add that as we think about how these things move around and disperse themselves, Emily, I think, mentioned that it's primarily through birds, and birds are often perching along hedgerows. So it's a great place for them to be depositing seeds.
Great, thank you all. So Sam, while you're at it, you had mentioned some apps. So just wondering if you could recommend a few that you have enjoyed or thought worked well, and maybe just sort of pop them in the chat.
Yeah, I can try to do that. The one that I have used is, I think, called Picture This. I'll try to find that one. It seems to work pretty well. You always kind of have to fact check an app, but I do find it very useful being out in the field when you're not quite sure, and you can take a picture and it helps you narrow down some of the lookalikes. Another one that I know a lot of folks use is called Seek. That I think is an iNaturalist app. You can try to find that one as well. Yeah, they really are handy. Again, I was resistant. I thought, gosh, I should just be able to identify plants, but sometimes you're out there and leaves look weird and you're seeing a bunch of different things, and it really can be useful for identifying them. So yeah, I'll try to find a couple of links for those.
That's great. That's great. Thanks. Emily or Dan, any that you've used that you found helpful?
Just yesterday, I actually used the photo search function on Google to identify an invasive plant that I hadn't seen before. So that's another good option if you want to Google it.
I'm a big fan of the Seek app. I've been just started using that, and it's very cool.
That's great. All right, I'm gonna have to add that to my list too. Thank you for the suggestions. Is there, so this is a kind of question for you all, you know, Dan, you had talked about, you know, fortunately, Northeast Kingdom is sort of the last frontier in terms of invasives in Vermont. Is there a list of, you know, invasive plants in addition to the ones that you guys have focused on that folks should just be aware of, you know, are likely or are present in the kingdom?
You know, I'll let someone else answer beyond this. I know VT Invasives has a list of everything that has currently been found in the state of Vermont. That's the only official list I know of, but I'll let you folks answer.
I'm not aware of any specifically. I don't know if the iNaturalist app or folks who are actually recording occurrences of things might be able to pull something from that. But, you know, I'd also say that these things persist because they're good at just being under our noses for a while. And so I wouldn't limit, if you're interested in this topic, I wouldn't limit it just to a list of local species. That's a great place to start, but there's likely others that we haven't identified yet that are around. And we need, an early detection is key, like has been mentioned. So the sooner we can find those, the better. But that's a really important question. And if we find anything in the next little bit, we can share that out with follow-up resources.
Great, thank you. And just a follow-up question to that, what about kudzu, the absolute horror plant that has taken over the South? The person is wondering if that's what they see in the open swales in South Wheelock. So I don't know if any of you know what plant that person might be talking about, but that might look like kudzu.
I think that's actually, so we don't have kudzu that we know of yet, but I'd welcome you to send a picture if you see it. But I think I know where that person's talking about, and I think it's actually knotweed there, which it does look similar. They're both bamboo-like.
Great. So Emily, I know if folks do have a picture they want to send, they could submit it through VT Invasives. Is that the best way to kind of submit it? Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
That is the best way. And I don't know if my email is present on here, but you're welcome to share that with the list too.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Emily. So then again, good way to just verify what you're seeing, another tool for you. Okay, Sam, what's up with the blue on the stump? What was going on there with the stump with the herbicide?
Yeah, so a lot of applicators add a colorful dye to the herbicide they're using, and that's a good way to keep track of which stumps you've sprayed. It also kind of lets you know if anything's leaking. You'll see it very quickly on your gloves. So yeah, a lot of applicators add a colored dye to herbicides to be able to keep track of it. It's easy to lose stumps after you've sprayed them.
Great. Excellent. And I hear there's just a couple of questions that are just looking for some motivation or some hope, because it can be pretty overwhelming to tackle these, especially if, you know, Phoebe's talking about she has just so many on her 10-acre property. It just feels so overwhelming. So, and Jessica's, you know, asking for specific hope about dealing with knotweed. So I don't know if, you know, any of you have any, just Sam, with your work with the lots of properties you deal with, like, can people keep hope alive? Like, you know,
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that one because I spent my entire day here at Bluffside controlling invasive plants with a group of people, and I had a fantastic day. And I would say a couple of things that help with that. Definitely get some people to help you. It's incredible the difference it makes. Trying to do this yourself by yourself is really discouraging. Doing it with 3 or 4 friends or people you're working with is really motivating. And then the other thing that I find very motivating is identifying some of those native plants. So as you're going through, even if you have tons of invasives, if you can find a few native plants mixed in there, it really feels like you're doing something good when you clear out some space around those. So those are the things that keep me on the positive side of this.
Great. Dan or Emily, any more to share there?
I like that. I like that positive note of looking for native plants because you can always find them. Yeah, I tend to take things very, very linearly, very mathematically. So I break any project up into very lots of little steps, and that helps me and timelines and knowing that it'll take a while to get them all, but you can kind of keep taking efforts to suppress and control. So I had a big 45-acre project. And, I spent a year just finding the big clumps, and that was the only thing I did. And I was like, I'm just going to identify the big clumps. And then I took time to make a plan. And then, like Sam mentioned, I got a helper and did the first step. And then the following year I did the next step. And so that's what I do, is just break it up into steps and make sure to have a solid plan, because it can feel overwhelming when you're wandering around and you're just seeing it everywhere.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. That's great. Great advice. So I think we'll probably, since it's 8:02, we'll take one more question. And since I know most of us compost in the state, any advice for composting the invasives separately? What are some sort of best practices for dealing with invasives once you've removed them or cut them? Or
Kind of a tough one. I'll start. Very curious to hear what Emily or Dan or Caitlin, you've probably worked on this as well. Increasingly, I have tried not to move invasives far from where I've removed them. So I really try to compost things close to the site. Some plants like honeysuckle, I've been able to just make big brush piles and they really don't resprout that much. Other plants, if you're pulling out rhizomes, those probably do have a lot of potential to resprout. Sometimes I've composted them a little bit of pulling them out of a wetland and then putting them on a tarp to make sure that they don't root into the ground wherever they're composting, leaving them there. Yeah, it can be kind of tough. And then certainly monitoring your compost pile. That's probably the biggest thing. Just monitor that pile. If it starts to regrow, you might just have to kind of shuffle it around, but definitely make sure that it doesn't establish a new population.
those are all great suggestions, Sam. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions, and thanks to Sam, Emily, and Dan for sharing a lot of great information. As we mentioned, there'll be an email with some resources. You can, as Emily said, if you have a plant that you have a question about, I know there were some questions we didn't get to about ID, you can always submit pictures online. Another resource I'll mention is the Master Gardener Network. They're all trained in invasive plant identification, and you can always submit questions related to them also to Master Gardeners. So with that, I guess, unless Sam, Emily, or Dan, do you want to wrap us up with some final comments, or should we just sign off?
I just thank folks for coming tonight and their interest, and I know it's a big challenge and it feels like a big mountain sometimes, but any little bit we do is going to help our forests and help our native wildlife kind of restore those connections.
Great. Excellent. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.